Okay, should I begin? Dean, do you want to do the camera or should I? Give us 1 second and we will be right with you. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for all of your patience today. We've been having technical issues. I blame the hurricane. Um, so anyway, hi, welcome to our community lecture night. My name's Elisa Grishman. We do audio descriptions of ourselves here to make it more accessible for people who are blind and low vision. So I am a fat white woman with brown curly hair, and I am wearing a black t-shirt that says, I'll be taking my thoughts and prayers to the ballot box. I want to first thank everyone who's, first of all, been patient with us tonight. I want to especially thank my board of directors. Uh, I have Debbie Cherry, Donna and Sippa Holmes, Kendra Hobdy, and Monica Albert Still. I want to thank Dean for being here doing all of our in-person technology, Katie for being our online moderator, Clean Air Tools Pittsburgh for coming out and providing uh, air filtration systems, Disability Pride Pennsylvania for being our fiscal agent, and a huge thank you to the Three Rivers Community Foundation, whose grant has made this night possible. Uh, Anyone who's in the room, I just want to encourage you to mute your phones. For people on Zoom, please stay muted unless you are specifically called on by Katie, our moderator. Uh, I won't go through the emergency exits because everyone here knows all of them, but we do have emergency exits. And after last time, they do now have an area of disability refuge for people with mobility disabilities to get out of the building in a case of a fire. This is being recorded and will be available on YouTube afterwards. So I'll share the link out once uh, once we have that all done. For the Q&A, if you're in the room, please wait until you have the mic in front of you so that people online can hear you. We do have Zoom chat disabled for the majority of things so that it doesn't interrupt people who are using screen readers. However, you will be able to send a message to our moderator, Katie, if you need to. When it comes time to do the Q&A, if you raise your hand in the either in person, literally raise your hand. If you're on Zoom, just use the function on the bottom under reactions, I think it's called, and there's a raise hand function. Everyone who's participating, I'm going to be sending a survey out afterwards. We'd love to get your feedback on how you heard about this, what you thought of the lecture, what things you'd like to hear in future lectures. Please, if you could fill that out, it's so helpful for us to be able to learn how to better do things in the future. And finally, uh, we run fully on donations and charitable contributions. If anyone is interested in helping us fund future activities, if you go to accessmobpittsburgh.org/donate, you will find the way to, help us out in the future. So without further ado, uh, I'm going to introduce, I'm so used to being able to lick my finger. Sorry. I won't read the whole bios just to save us a little bit of time, but Mallory Hudson is here with us from the Keystone Progress Education Fund. She is a community organizer doing disability work there. And Paul O'Hanlon is a retired lawyer and sits on the City County Task Force on Disabilities. Both of them are dear, wonderful people, and uh, yeah, I'll let them start in. So thank you everyone again for your patience and for coming out tonight.
Um, I think I'm supposed to start. Um, and Let me start by sharing my screen so that you can see our slide presentation. Um, oh, you cannot start screen share while other participant is sharing. So, okay, let me try this again.
Give us 1 second. It's on our end.
Got it. All right, so everybody sees that, I assume. So I'm going to read each slide because not everybody can. And let me,
Oh, Paul, you can share now.
I think I am I?
Oh, yes, you're good.
Okay, great. So, and let me just see if I can, let's see. I have to move my images so I can, okay, good, that works. So, the title of our talk tonight, and I want to thank all the people who did the tech stuff in the background. I know it was a struggle, and I know I couldn't have done it, so thank you. Also, I wouldn't have done this talk without the partnership of Mallory Hudson, so thank you. And the title of our talk today is If People with Disabilities Are the Largest Minority Population in American Politics, Why Isn't Anyone Trying to Get My Vote? Um, and so, and I have to, give an aside that when I signed up for this, that Facebook had it on my screen as an upcoming event, and it sort of cut short the question where, if people with disabilities are the largest minority population in American politics, why? And then dot, dot, dot. And I realized that, shit, there's a whole universe of questions that this opens up, because it's not just, well, why isn't anyone trying to get my vote, but what's the potential impact of being the largest minority population in American politics? And as an aside, in a way, I'm sort of disturbed that no one seems to be trying to get my vote. So 1 in 5. So if you don't know the statistics, 1 in 5, or roughly 20% of everybody, everybody is somebody with a disability. And as we know, and probably just looking at the people in the room, people with disabilities don't look a certain way, and there's an incredible breadth of differences that are included in the category of disabilities. And one of the biggest ironies is that not everybody that we consider to be a person with a disability considers themselves to be a person with a disability. Particularly when you look at people who are in the sort of senior category, and the aged population, that lots of people with disabilities in the aging community considers themselves old, and that there are consequences of getting old, and they don't think that it's a disability that they have, or that they don't sort of treat themselves as, or think of themselves as being a person with a disability. So, part of what, just to give you sort of the preview of the outline of the talk, I'm going to sort of talk about why it's hard, and why I think we're doing it wrong, because that's what I do best, is talk about what we're doing wrong. And then now is going to talk about what we could do, that's sort of um, what we could do to make it better. And so that's kind of my brief preview. So there, when we look at the laws intended to improve access for people with disabilities, there's a long bulleted list. And again, because I know that not everybody can read this screen, I'm going to read it. And as I read it, notice the dates. So the Fair Housing Act of 1968 amended in 1988 to include people with disabilities as a protected class. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, which was later renamed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, in 1990. The Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act of 1980, Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act of 1984, the Air Carrier Access Act of 1986, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, and the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So, what you have are laws that go from, critical needs like housing to, kind of more narrow focused laws like the civil rights of institutionalized persons, and then really broad, um, encompassing laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's a real range, but what I found kind of interesting as I went through this is that they're all kind of sandwiched in a time frame between really 1973 um, and 1996. And I would argue that the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, has really been the high watermark of the advocacy. And what I mean by that is I think it's our greatest accomplishment, as in terms of laws, and it's also, I think, our greatest organizing accomplishment. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So what you found, so this next screen focuses on the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and there are two fairly iconic pictures, one of which on the left side are individuals with, I would say, visible disabilities crawling up the steps to the U.S. Capitol. And this was timed to coincide when Congress was considering passage of the ADA. And then on the right is a picture of a street rally. You can see a variety of people, but above the heads of everybody is a big banner with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Saying, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And I think that, there are a lot. The picture on the right, both pictures are really both iconic, and like every good picture tells a million stories. And part of what we see in the right, with the banner quoting Martin Luther King, was a real attempt on the part of the disability community to show linkages to the civil rights movement. And because it wasn't, and still isn't, clear to people, lots of people, that what we're talking about is civil rights and civil rights law, and not just, issues of zoning or whatever. The next slide has two pictures. On the left is a woman holding up a handmade sign. What you can kind of see is 504 is law, referring to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and it's now law. Now make it a reality. And the story behind this picture is that Section 504 was passed in the early 1970s, but it was really not until 1990 that, just before that, that Section 504 was implemented. So, for example, Section 504 required that any entity that received funding from the federal government had to provide discrimination-free service with respect to people with disabilities. And so that had a huge impact, for example, on public transportation, because up to that point, all buses had steps up into them. No buses had lifts or ramps. Public transportation was largely not an option for people, for example, who use wheelchairs. And so getting 504 passed turned out to be much easier than getting it to be implemented. And on the right is a picture of some of the advocacy that I was involved in. Let Our Voices Be Heard was a group that Rachel Friend and I helped to organize people with disabilities. And on the there's two kind of T-shirts that are modeled by models. I don't know, plastic things that hold up T-shirts. And the one on the right says "Let Our Voices Be Heard," and the one on the left says "My voice counts, I vote." And this was in reference to a campaign that we were waging at that point called the We Count campaign. And We Count really looked at performance of agencies under the National Voter Registration Act. So the National Voter Registration Act that allows people, or in fact mandates, that the Department of Motor Vehicles offer voter registration to people who get driver's licenses and have automobile titles and anything that you deal with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. Any interaction should be coupled with a opportunity to register to vote. And that same duty that Congress imposed on the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, Congress also imposed on agencies that primarily served people with disabilities. And so most of the disability service agencies have a similar duty. In fact, the duty is called the duty to act as a voter registration site and to, at a minimum, offer on a regular basis the people they serve, at a minimum. So in other words, if you're some random neighbor that walks in and says, "Hey, can I register to vote here?" the answer should be yes. And so what we found was that it wasn't being done, and it was clearly not being done. It was sort of publicly not being done. And we discovered that when we discovered that every year there's a report issued to the Pennsylvania legislature on the performance of these kinds of agencies. And we discovered that this was this would have been 2000, I think, and 5. And so we discovered in 2004, which was the year before that was being reported on, Allegheny County disability agencies registered a total of zero voters, and that it had been zero for a number of years, and statewide it was zero in most states, and the total for the entire state was some pathetic number that was around 100. And so what becomes clear is that even when you get laws passed that are supposed to benefit the disability community, if you don't really focus on enforcement, it just doesn't happen. Systems change doesn't come easily and without vigilance. And so I think that one of the things that became clear is that for anything from whether it's public transportation becoming accessible to agencies, um, offering voter registration services, if we weren't making sure it happened, it generally wasn't going to happen. And it sort of reinforced for me this saying that all politics is local. That when you look at big picture, world changing, sort of systems changing things, when it all where the rubber hits the road is at the local level. And if it isn't happening at the local level, if the pressure isn't happening, if we aren't enforcing it at the local level, then it just is all pipe dreams. So the one example of how things that there's an impact of local politics. Take, for example, the issue of exclusionary zoning laws, or what became known as redlining. So, um, basically, from the 1930s through the 1960s, we engaged in a kind of social experiment. And what that was that we divided our cities into those areas that we were willing to invest in, and those versus those areas that we simply weren't willing to invest in. And generally speaking, what you'll find is that the areas that we weren't willing to invest in were areas where large numbers of people of color live, or immigrants of other nationalities, and that was a fairly conscious race-based zoning sort of set of practices that were put into place. And that when you look at reality today, so much of um, what we see in our cities today reflect the redlining that started in the 1930s, and that changing the law, changing, making it, a felony to continue to practice or perpetuate this kind of exclusionary zoning hasn't been enough. That it really requires enforcement, and that happens at the local level. So if what I'm going to do works, you're going to see a video from somebody that sort of explained this better than I am.
So I recently saw this post, disagreeing with Chaperone about her, talking about voting locally. And he says, "Babe, I love you, but my local zoning commissioner election is not more important to Kamala Harris preventing 2 major Supreme Court nominations when Thomas and Alito retire." And I told you, I'm going to tell you what I said. But this line of thinking that local elections are less important than, the national elections is not only completely false, it's also systemic. Right? Because yes, a lot of issues come from the top down, but a lot of them come from the ground up. And a zoning commissioner is a perfect example of this shit. Did you know that redlining was banned in 1968? 50 plus years ago, right? Redlining, the practice of segregating neighborhoods in the United States, was banned in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. However, look at the redlining that took place from the 30s until 1968 still have impact today, that 3 out of every 4 neighborhoods in the USA were redlined, and that still are moderate to low income today. Redlining creates barriers to voting to this day. You want to know why? It's a little thing that I like to talk about quite often. Disability. To this day, previously redlined neighborhoods have some of the highest rates of disability in the country. And have you all looked up some of the barriers to voting for people with disabilities and chronic illnesses in this country? Have you cared? For zoning from the 30s impacts people's ability to vote today. Not to mention that if anyone's zoning commissioner, right, rejects multifamily housing, rejects mixed-use dwelling in favor of those McMansions and sprawling estates, that could change the trajectory of that community's voting history for decades to come. Not only is this a president up for election, but 468 House and Senate seats are also up for election. Not to mention thousands of state and local elections as well. Kamala Harris is elected and then re-elected. The totality of those 2 terms is 8 years. Who you vote for zoning commissioner, that could last centuries.
Let me. Oh, okay, good. So I wanted to just kind of go back a bit and highlight kind of part of what my thesis is. So I want to go back to the time when kind of all of this was really happening as far as legislation, and the group that I'm highlighting at the moment on the screen is ADAPT. ADAPT in the beginning was an abbreviation for I forget what, Americans with Disabilities, something about public transit, I believe. But ADAPT, when I first became aware of them, was doing a lot of sort of street protests and street actions around the fact that buses, public transportation was inaccessible. And so ADAPT did all kinds of really great things like, blocked buses and handcuffed themselves to buses, held buses just hostage for days on end, and was able through this, to sort of energize the disability community over the issue of accessibility to public transit, and really, I think, fostered a whole wealth of local communities that started advocating for public transit. I know that until Port Authority, our public transit in Pittsburgh started to become accessible. So in 1990, the federal government finally implemented Section 504 as it related to the Department of Department of Transportation. And so it came up with their Section 504 regulations for accessibility requirements for public transportation. And in 1990, Port Authority bought their first kind of group of accessible buses. It was a small number of buses that allowed them to make a handful of routes that had only accessible buses assigned to those routes, and was the beginning of basically transforming their system into what became the first large transit system in the country to become fully Section 504 ADA compliant. And a lot of the reason why it was so successful was through the advocacy of the local community here in Pittsburgh that really made it happen. And up to that point, I was a poverty advocate. I was working for legal services as a housing lawyer. I wasn't really active in the disability community, but the possibility of having an accessible transit system drew me to that movement and really became the reason why I became active in the disability community. And what I draw from that are a number of conclusions. One of which is that, again, it's really what happens at the local level that really is the measure of whether what we aspire to have happen with federal legislation actually happens at the ground level, and that what we need to do is to put more resources into local organizing to develop local groups of people with disabilities working on local issues, because then when bigger issues come up before Congress, we already have an active kind of uh, group of advocates that are, ready and able to take an issue like that on. So looking at the issue of voting, there are lots and lots of barriers to people with disabilities being able to vote. And so I'm going to do a quick read through these just to sort of kind of give you a sense of the breadth and range of issues. So there are inaccessible polling places. It's the law, but it still is the case that every election there's inaccessible polling places. Pennsylvania allows no curbside voting, even for polling places where it's officially designated as not accessible. The state won't allow curbside voting, even as a reasonable accommodation. Insufficient poll worker training. People go to the polls. They have the right to bring the person of their choice to assist them in the polls, and you have all kinds of random things happen because, quite frankly, the poll workers don't always know what they're doing. And so, even the best laws, even the best procedures, even the best of intentions sometimes aren't enough when you don't actually do proper training. Insufficient accommodations from accessible ballot marking devices. When you sort of dig down into the accommodations that the various disability groups need, oftentimes they just don't happen. An accessible ballot marking device, if nobody else uses it in that precinct and the poll workers don't really know how to use it, when that blind person or shows up and wants to vote privately, they don't know what the heck they're doing. So there's all kinds of problems like that. Inability to return accessible remote ballots remotely. We're still trying to kind of sort out how we make the system kind of coherent. Complex mail-in ballot return instructions, county policies that conceal mail-in ballot errors, difficulty acquiring photo ID. If you're a driver, it's real easy to get a photo ID. If you're not a driver, it's trickier. It doesn't come easy. You have to make a point of it. I mean, it's one of the reasons why photo ID is a problem. Limited public transportation, including paratransit services. All kinds of things happen on election day. Plans change, and oftentimes the transit that you have available can't change like it needs to if circumstances change. Poll work, sometimes polls are reassigned to other locations. You show up, polls don't always open on time. All kinds of problems that sometimes then translate into a transportation problem, difficulty finding accessible information about elections in accessible formats like ASL or large print, and confusing jargon. Every field has its own kind of internal language, and when you get into universal things like voting, jargon is a problem where not everybody understands all the terms like mail-in remote accessible alternative ballots. emergency alternative ballots and provisional ballots, and lots of people at that point are completely lost. And the other problem that I would argue that we as a community face is that to a large extent, we, based on our disability type or accessibility needs, we're served by mostly community nonprofits or 501c3 organizations that provide everything from home health care and Meals on Wheels, and I mean I could list things on and on and on. And what you'll find is that there's all kinds of limitations on these types of organizations regarding political activity. What's really prohibited is partisan political activity. And when you kind of dig down, really what you're not allowed to do is sort of endorse particular candidates or parties or be partisan in that way. But the problem is that most, in my experience, most nonprofits understand that limitation to really limit them from being political at all. And so lots of community nonprofits just aren't political. You're not going to find them at a rally. You're not going to find them, part of a raucous group confronting their elected officials for the over lack of progress. They just aren't willing to do that because they're sort of protecting their image. They're doing a lot of things, but they're not really. In my assertion is they're not somebody that has your back, and I've learned that over and over because they're protecting their own back. And so, what are we supposed to do about this? And so, fortunately, Mel Hudson is here and can give us some really good ideas about what we're supposed to do about this. So let me pass this on to Mel.
Thank you, Paul. Can everyone hear me okay?
I'm here.
Unless someone says otherwise, I will assume that everyone's good. Is it just me? This is a Mallory problem. Is that better? Thank you. And thanks, Paul.
I'm trying to figure out.
The slides, if you can.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to mute myself. I've got all
Okay.
these. All right. Okay. Mute.
While Paul's working on that, I just want to say that, to kind of wrap up and summarize what Paul talked about, a lot of the reasons that our elected officials aren't seeking our votes are related to structural ableism, right? So these systems of both historical and contemporary policies, institutions, and societal norms and practices that have devalued and disadvantaged people who are disabled, neurodivergent, chronically ill, mad, or living with mental illnesses, and then therefore privileged people who are positioned as able-bodied and able-minded. So all of these different things that have impacted us in society and how we are positioned as voters is because of a system of ableism. So, like Paul said, what are we supposed to do about it? How do we train and motivate our lawmakers to value our contributions and to seek them out? So, civic participation obviously includes voting. When Elisa first contacted us about doing a talk today, she wanted us to talk about voting. And obviously, we're doing that, but we're talking about other types of civic engagement as well. So, our civic participation can include formal and informal activities like voting, volunteering, participating in group activities, and a whole lot more. Individual activities that benefit society are things like voting, right? We don't just vote on behalf of our own individual interests, but the interests of our community and the community we want to build and be part of. This would also include group activities that benefit other group members. So I think of the Pittsburgh Steel Wheelers, that everyone in that group is benefiting by being there and being together and competing in accessible sports. And then also there are group activities that benefit society, like our friends at Access Mob Pittsburgh. Please get involved. They're fun and wonderful and cool, similar to ADAPT, which I did look up in case anyone was wondering. ADAPT initially stood for American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today. Their big things in the beginning and kind of still today are or were both public transportation and like home and community-based services. And we're doing some technical stuff over here. Can you all still hear me? Okay, I can't hear me, so that's fine though. Yeah, so obviously civic participation is super important and it's a lot more than voting, right? Voters need reasons to motivate them to vote. So we have to, work together to identify some unifying issues and organize around those issues. Community engagement and grassroots activism are the things that keep our elected officials accountable, right? Like we are the ones hiring them. Going through a campaign seems like the worst job application process I've ever heard of in my life, but they work for us. We're the ones hiring them and we need to remind them of that. And we do that by getting together and figuring out what the important issues are and then holding those officials accountable through our vote and through other forms of engagement. So thank you, Paul. So I love this phrase, nothing about us without us. It began with some grassroots organizing in South Africa in the 80s, I think. But essentially what it's saying is that, everything that is about us or for us or related to us and our benefit has to include us because we know ourselves and our communities best. And kind of as Paul alluded to earlier, lately we haven't been doing everything all right. Like our legislators should be looking to us for solutions to problems in our communities. But they aren't looking to us and we aren't always offering those solutions. But they need the votes, right? To keep their jobs, they need votes. And we need to have demands and expectations and then hold them accountable as a larger like cross disability community. So we have to do homework and get together and plan and do essentially a big group project to remind our elected officials, what they need to be doing. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, they're representing us and our needs. Our disabilities, like our communities, are super diverse. If two people with the same diagnosis can have different needs, then it stands to reason that many people with many different disabilities, all living in different contexts, will have diverse needs and concerns. And each one of those needs and concerns informs your perspective, which is valuable to the advancement of the broader disability community. Sometimes we'll be in small specific groups and we'll organize around specific issues, but when we come together across disabilities, we're organizing around shared values and experiences that will benefit all of us. And also, we should be reminding people benefit folks who are not yet disabled, because it's not really a matter of if, it's when. Sometimes Monica's over there laughing. Sometimes disability comes on and it's age related, and that's okay. And it's still a disability, and we should all be planning for that, because I think we all want to live like long, happy lives. And, losing some type of like quote unquote functioning shouldn't mean that we can't participate and enjoy ourselves and be whole human beings as we were prior to a disability, right? So Paul, can you move over to the next slide? So we should be getting together and get unified, especially with regards to voting. We should be getting unified on some like common issues. So I included Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. I don't know if anyone took like an intro level psychology course before, but this was absolutely in your textbook. And you'll notice that a lot of the issues I have listed on the left that I'll talk about more specifically are related to those bottom two parts of the pyramid, right? So our physiological needs and our safety needs. Those are the things that we have to meet before we can move on to like enjoying our lives and loving ourselves and becoming our best selves, right? We need to have those like basic human needs met, our physical and psychological, I would argue, and our safety needs. So most of the issues related to those things, are related to the disability community also, across all disabilities, are related to those bottom two parts of the pyramid. So that would include things like poverty, housing, transportation, healthcare, long-term supports and services, childcare, education, and employment. There are not a ton of like cross-disability organizing efforts, especially not today, but there is strength in numbers. So we have to look at those issues and organize around them and find that like common value that brings people who have maybe different specific needs, bring us together so we can be that big, powerful group. I think Paul agrees with me that poverty is a really big unifying issue in the disability community, because having a disability increases your chance, or having a disability increases your chance of going into poverty. And then living in poverty also increases your chance of developing a disability, and it also increases the impact of that disability on your life. And yet, to this day, SSI recipients are not permitted to have more than $2,000 in savings, and that number hasn't changed since 1985. And if the maximum allowable savings for SSI recipients increased with inflation, it would be close to about $6,000 today. And I know we have things like ABLE accounts, and I do encourage people to look into that because it can be helpful, but ultimately people with disabilities are being excluded from like basic financial independence, because of policies like this, because that $2,000 in savings is not, there are no strings attached to that. But an ABLE account, even though it's pretty good, especially in Pennsylvania, there are strings, there are extra hoops you have to go through. And I just don't believe fundamentally that disabled people should have to do that to have like basic resources. Because a roof on your house is a lot more than $2,000. It's also a lot more than $6,000, by the way. I'm glad I don't own a house, but also I wish I could. Paul, can you move on to the next slide? So we wanted to talk a bit about like the social ecology of advocacy. So, advocacy involves effective participation in actions that target the impact of our social, political, economic, or cultural factors to promote changes in individuals, groups, organizations, communities, and society. And I have this little diagram on the right here. It is a set of like nested circles. The smallest circle that is most inside of all the other circles says individual. The circle around it says interpersonal. The one around that says community, and the one around that says society. And this is like kind of based on the social ecological model, which is a very cool model in public health that I encourage people to look at. But I really like this diagram and that model in general because it emphasizes, one, that issues and solutions occur on multiple levels. So they occur at the individual level, like what can I do to educate myself so that I can advocate for myself in the future? They happen at the interpersonal level. How can I help a friend advocate for themselves? How can I educate a friend so that they know what their rights are when they go vote? They happen at the community level. So how can I make sure organizations in my community know that they are responsible for getting people registered to vote, for example? And then at the society level, so this can include public policy. This can also include like social attitudes. And all of these systems together, right, or all of these together work together to create systems and reinforce or possibly, if with the right solutions, dismantle things like structural ableism that keep us from voting and really participating in our communities. And I just like to include this diagram because it, emphasizes like the interaction between and the interdependence of all of these factors and all of these levels related to every single issue that's out there. And individuals and their environments are reciprocal. We're always influencing one another. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind, right? Like our impact is sometimes at the individual level, sometimes it's at the society level, and they're all good and important. And not every single person has to be every single thing. And previously, a lot of our home and community-based service providers used to organize around issues. And unfortunately, they're not really able to do that anymore. So in 1981, when the HCBS, like the 1915C Medicaid waivers for home and community-based services, when that was enacted in 1981, obviously that was like a huge win for the disability community because finally we had a more formal system of like funding these supports outside of institutions. And that changed the business model of those organizations. So they were no longer focusing on advocacy, they were focusing on providing services. And with the fee-for-service model, they have to be financially prudent so that they can provide services to people and ultimately do what they wanted to do, which hopefully was, help people live their best lives. But they stopped hiring organizers and they decreased their advocacy efforts. And Paul mentioned like the limitations on 501c3 nonprofits earlier. Keystone Progress Education Fund is also a nonpartisan 501c3 nonprofit, but we are not a service provider. We specifically do this kind of advocacy work. So we know how to do it and we know how to do it well. And we know how to find funding for organizers like myself to do this kind of work. And that's just kind of outside of the scope of what HCBS providers do now. But that's okay because we can organize ourselves and each other around our specific issues as well as our shared values. So thank you, Paul, for switching the slide. So I've talked a little bit about organizing. What is organizing? It involves a lot of stuff, but essentially we are trying to enable people to turn the resources they have into the power that they need to make the changes that they want. So I have a little diagram on the side. At the top, it's like kind of a comic. At the top, there's a big fish chasing a school of little fish. And then underneath it says organize. And then at the very bottom, there's a school of little fish shaped like a bigger fish that are then together kind of shaped in a larger fish, then chasing the small fish. So, together as a large group, we have more power and more impact. And then I'm actually going to skip the next couple of slides. Paul, can you go to the slide that says, how do I get involved? Perfect. So yeah, like I mentioned, I work for an organization called Keystone Progress Education Fund. We do voter education, voter registration, and mail-in ballot requests. We're really focusing on those efforts within the disability community. So we've been doing a lot of targeted outreach in skilled nursing facilities, personal care homes, and with some HCBS providers. But we're also interested in learning from the community. So if there's anyone out there who thinks, hey, you could have an impact in some other way, or they want to get involved and volunteer, please reach out to me. My email will be on the last slide. And then I'm going to let Paul talk a little bit about ballots for patients.
Ballots for patients is, I guess, about a 15 or so year initiative where we go into area hospitals. At the moment, we're getting into all UPMC hospitals in Allegheny County. There's a possibility of us doing their hospital in Erie if we can get some local Erie folks interested in helping out with that. And basically what we do is we go through the process with each hospitalized voter who's interested in casting a vote, where they fill out their application for an emergency absentee ballot. We have people then take those to the elections office, file them, get the patient's ballot, bring it back to the hospital, allow them to complete it, and then we file it. So this year we may be breaking that process down into 2 days. Often we've done it in one day. We expect to be at all UPMC hospitals. We will be asking for volunteers to take on specific hospitals. We're on Facebook under the name Pittsburgh Ballots for Patients. There's a link on the screen, but it's probably easier just to sort of search for Pittsburgh Ballots for Patients.
It comes right up.
Say again?
It comes right up when you search. It says it's not
Yeah.
a page.
Yeah, and so and that's likely how we'll after you've been through a few elections, what you discover is that elections are sort of dynamic activities that it changes from day to day, day of. It's kind of wild and hectic, and we find kind of keeping up to date through Facebook is a pretty effective way so that anybody who wants to see what's happening, or if they could pitch in at the last minute, that's where we would be pitching for last minute volunteers or people to take on special cases. So I think that we had somebody who was hospitalized, and actually their child was hospitalized, and they lived in a different county, and he couldn't leave the hospital. And we had one volunteer who took on the job of driving her paperwork back and forth, and it ended up being an all-day process for that one voter. But as you can imagine, being the mom of a sick kid in the hospital, she thought it was a miracle. So it's a really rewarding thing to do on election day. And then I think this is we had two alternative slides. This is the slide I would choose. So do you want to say, do you want me or?
Yeah, do you want to read the quote?
Sure. So this is a quote from my friend and colleague, Rachel Friend, who unfortunately passed away about 10 years ago. And Rachel, here's what it says. Voting does more than elect politicians. Through the act of voting, people become dynamic players in the political arena where policy decisions are made, and both their political and personal power grows. They become active citizens connected with the community of voters. And, a lot of times people sort of dilute issue of voting to it being about winners and losers and politicians and all that. And the reality is that the real secret story is who does the voting and who they vote for, and that's really what makes that's really what makes the difference. And so I like that quote because I think that it really kind of conveys what we saw when we were organizing ballots for patients was that we saw people going through this process, that becoming a voter was a decision. It was a change of lifestyle in a way, but becoming a group of voters then puts you into a different, each one became a developmental step, but becoming active citizens connected with the community of voters really was the result. And I think that that's, in my opinion, what we should aim for, that highlighting the winners and losers obscures, I think, all the important things that happen below the surface. So I don't know if we have time for questions or.
No, unfortunately, we do not have any time for question and answer. I will say, if anyone has a question for Well, Mallory has her email address on the screen. It's mallory@keystoneprogress.org. If anyone has a question for Paul or just a question for Access Mob in general, you can email it to accessmobpittsburgh@gmail.com. So on that note, I am going to give a giant thank you to Paul and to Mel for coming out tonight and giving such a wonderful lecture. Thank you to my board, thank you to Disability Pride PA, and thank you to the Three Rivers Community Foundation. Thank you for everyone for your patience at the beginning of this. Next month's lecture is, there you go, sorry. Next month's lecture is on November 25th. It's going to be fully online, and it is everything you need to know about Pennsylvania waiver programs. And then Monday, January 27th, ableism in medicine is representation the solution we need. To find out more, go to accessmobpittsburgh.org. The website is listed at the top of the screen there. There is a drop-down menu that's called Community Lecture Nights. You can find out more information and register there. I skipped your one slide, Debbie, if you want to go back. We'll gratefully appreciate any donations that we can get to help keep these community lecture nights running. They help with overhead, sign language interpreters, just everything. So if you don't want to do it off the QR codes on the screen, if you go to accessmobpittsburgh.org/donate, that's a great way to help out. Did we have any other slides? Okay, well, on that note, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful night. Try not to get swept away in the rain.